Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And if you're following along real time, many of us over the last week have been watching with shock and horror and helplessness as Russia has invaded Ukraine. We thought now would be a good time to feature the church behind me, St. Michael the Archangel Ukrainian Church and Baltimore's Ukrainian community. Ukrainians started arriving in Baltimore in the 1880s, along with waves of immigrants from other Eastern European countries. By the 1890s, we had a Ukrainian store in Fells Point, and Catholic priests were coming down to administer to the growing Catholic Ukrainian population here. In that first wave, most of the Ukrainians arriving in Baltimore were from the Western Ukraine, and most were Catholic. By 1893, the congregation that built this church had formed, and other Ukrainians had built another church called St. Peter and Paul Ukrainian Church, not too far away here in East Baltimore. In the early 1900s, the Ukrainian community here continued to grow. That was the first wave, say 1880s up until about World War I. The second wave came in the 1930s, and it was folks coming from, in that period, were escaping persecution, and they were escaping being put into forced labor camps or sent to Siberia or worse. And really, many people were fleeing from what was called the Holodomor famine. The Holodomor famine happened in the early 1930s, and it killed millions of Ukrainians. It was really horrific. It was perhaps even more horrific because it was man-made. It was not caused by a drought or a blight on a crop. It was caused by humans, and in particular one human, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, he began implementing programs that were taking farms away from peasants and forcing the peasants into collective farms. The agricultural productivity plummeted, causing severe food shortages. That was at the heart of the starvation. But on top of that, the Ukrainians in particular were rebelling. Many peasants formed groups to rebel against this horrendous policy. And in fact, the rebellions in the Ukraine had become so significant that in 1932, Stalin wrote to one of his comrades, he said, "If we don't do something, we may lose Ukraine." That sounds kind of familiar today even. So what did Stalin do? What he did was he put towns in Ukraine on a blacklist and prohibited them from receiving food allotments, food assistance, and then he prohibited the residents of those towns from going elsewhere to try to find food. And finally, in 1932 and 1933, groups led by local police and party officials who were pro-Stalin raided peasants' homes and took what little food they had left. So really pretty barbaric. Many people died, and many fled to places like here in Baltimore. The Russians did a very good job of suppressing news of the famine for almost 50 years. And in fact, it wasn't until the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown, news that Russia also tried to suppress, when that happened, folks started really poking around at what other things Russia had repressed, and the Holodomor famine became much more widely known. Here in Baltimore, May 29th, 2008, then Mayor Sheila Dixon presided over a ceremony where we welcomed a torch that had been lit in Kyiv and was traveling around the globe to remember the horrible famine from the 1930s. So that was the second wave of immigrants. The third wave of immigrants from Ukraine coming into Baltimore happened in the 1970s and the 1980s. And these folks weren't Catholic, they were Jewish, and they were escaping ramped up anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, 70% of Baltimore's Soviet Jewish population was from Ukraine, and of that, a third was from just one city, Odessa, that was at that time part of our Sister Cities program. But let's wrap up back here along Eastern Avenue in East Baltimore, just south of Patterson Park. This stretch is often called Little Ukraine, and in addition to St. Michael the Archangel Church behind me, there is the financial institution, Self-Reliant Baltimore Federal Credit Union, that was started in the 1950s by Ukrainians and for Ukrainians. There's the Ukrainian American Youth Association of Baltimore, not too far away, and the Dnipro Ukrainian Club, a sports league also here in East Baltimore. And then, of course, annually there is the Baltimore Ukrainian Festival that's now held on the grounds of the church behind me, which has music and dance and, of course, lots of pierogies. All right, let me wrap up with a word about the church. The congregation got started in 1893. By 1912, they had grown big enough that they outgrew the private homes they were worshiping in and the Polish church where they had been welcome. And they built their own church on Wolf Street in Fells Point. But by the 1970s, they had grown even more and were looking for a bigger space. In a concerted effort to remain in Baltimore City and to remain in East Baltimore, they bought the lot behind me. And after a decade of work and fundraising, the church was erected and opened its doors. When it was opening back then in the early 1990s, a Baltimore Sun reporter, Frank Somerville, wrote a great article about it. He said sort of inevitably, whenever there is a domed building built, it gets compared to St. Basil's in Moscow. But at the time, the Ukrainian leadership here were quick to point out it is not modeled after St. Basil's. It is modeled after a church in Kyiv called St. Sophia. There are 5 domes. It's called, I think, Cossack Baroque is the architectural term for it. 5 domes covered in copper and golden leaf. It immediately and still is a landmark here in East Baltimore. I'm going to wrap up with a humble suggestion. If you are looking for a way or ways to contribute to help Ukrainians, one way, maybe not the only way, but one way might be to buy pierogies. And I'm not joking. The church behind me has an annual pierogi sale, and it happens to be coming up on March 10th. There are all sorts of pierogies, and you can order them ahead through the church's website. We'll put a link for that in this video. So I'm going to conclude by saying thank you for joining us, and thank you for considering helping out our own local Ukrainian community as part of your larger efforts. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.